Jakarta at the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CGIR. His research focuses on enhancing the use of genetic resources, unraveling abiotic stress tolerance, drought, salinity, and heat mechanisms, and crop modeling. Today, as you already understood, he will talk about the forgotten crop species. His talk will be entitled Diversifying Our Nutritional Needs Away from Fossil Food, between brackets, investing on forgotten crops. Before giving the floor to Professor Ghanem to start his talk, I would like to mention that the main talk will take up to 30 minutes, and then we will have the Q&A session that will take up to 20 minutes. For the discussion, please post your written questions via the chat on Zoom, and do not wait until the end of the talk to ask them. You can post your questions in English or French as well. So we look forward to listening to you, Professor Ghanem, and to knowing more about this exciting topic. The floor is yours, Professor Ghanem.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the invitation that was extended to me by INRA, and I'll start sharing my screen. Just put it in a presentation mode. So is it? I hope it works. Oh,
yes.
Yeah, I guess there is a. Okay, now it works. Full screen, isn't it? It's working.
Yes, now it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I entitled my talk today, Diversifying Our Nutritional Needs Away from what I call fossil foods, and I'll explain why I name them fossil foods and why it is urgent to invest on what we tend to call forgotten crops. My talk will be divided into three main parts. The first question will be addressing how many crops feed the world, which is an important question, and what is a forgotten crop, and what are the recent initiatives for staple food diversification. I'll mention a couple of them. So as you know, to answer a simple question, it's a very simple question that has been asked for for a long time ago. How many crops feed the world? But before answering that core question, we need to look at the food that we eat. And as you see on this wheel presentation, I'll just put my pointer. So this represents the dependence of each region of the world in terms of calories that are derived from crops where primary regions of diversity are elsewhere. And you can see that we are completely interdependent. The Mediterranean region contributes a lot. West Asia, of course, by feeding other regions of the world. Some other places, if you look at the Caribbean, contribute much less. So we have much less crops coming from the Caribbean that contribute in the worldwide diet. So this means that we are completely interconnected for our calories intake. That's the presentation of the calorie intake, but you can extrapolate the same thing about the proteins, etc. And if we look at the last 50 years, how diets change. So that's a study that has been published in 2014, a quite interesting one, that shows basically the dots are the number of the different crops that were consumed in a country and in which countries, and the ellipse is the degree of variation among countries. So that's the first thing in 1961. As you can see, in 1961, we were eating a quite diverse type of diet. If you look at the data later on, there's something wrong with my... The dots are the number of the different... Okay, so in 1985, things are getting closer. The ellipse is getting more closer, and we're having more and more uniformized type of diets. In 2009, it's even getting narrower, and which means that the diets worldwide are becoming more and more similar. And if you look at it from a global scale, the changes between 1961 and 2009, you see that countries like Nepal, who were quite diverse, were eating diverse type of foods, became quite similar to the rest of the world in 2009. There are still some exceptions, like Niger, which is an African country that is still farther from the average in 2009. But globally, between 1961 and 2009, you had 69% decrease in our variability, which means that diets worldwide are becoming more and more similar, whether you are in Casablanca or in London or even in the United States. People tend to eat more or less the same thing. And I've given it a look, and I invite you to check that paper that I think was published today in The Guardian, that shows how Morocco, I took randomly Morocco and Austria, which is a country in Europe, and that's a comparison between 1961 and 2013. And as you can see, that people in Austria and Morocco had some diversification. They were eating less things, so those are the main products that people were eating. You see the list is there, and the red dots are the contribution of each in Morocco, and the other ones in grayish are from Austria. And you can see that you have still lots of gaps between the two, so they were not exactly similar, including for wheat. While in 2013, there's a problem with my, oops. I think there is a, can you see my screen? Because it's frozen.
We can see your screen.
Yeah. Okay, but it's frozen on, yeah, this slide. Okay, fine, fair enough. Yes. And you can see that in 2013, people basically in Morocco are virtually eating more and more things, which is normal because it's getting more, the variety of food that is available to us is quite diverse, but there is much more overlap between than before. You know, even if I would say that Morocco is not the worst, in the worst situation compared to other countries, because of the I mean, there is still a very nice tradition of locally consumed foods and prepared differently from what you can see dominating in the Western type of diet. But just to tell you that there is much more overlap than before in the foods we eat. The diets that we are eating are becoming more and more homogeneous. And to go back to the first question that I've asked at the very beginning, how many crops feed the world? If you look at the plants, historically, there are 30,000, so 30,000, 30,000 crop species that could be eaten. And out of them, we've used more than 7,000 plant species cultivated for food, historically speaking. So that would be, if each of these species would be a dot, that would be the concentration of this one. It would be the cloud. And if we look at now, less than 200, which are the dots are getting narrower, make major contributions to food production, either globally, regionally, and nationally. But if you have a closer look to the fact, you would see that only 9 would account for 66% of the total crop production in the world. And the 9 are quite known to all of us. They are maize, rice, wheat, soybean, etc. The list is there, so you can check it. Which means that out of the 7,000 that were historically grown, we are relying on only 9. And if we even get a closer look, we find out that maize, rice, wheat, and soybean are the big 4, or extendedly, we can call them the big 5. we're relying on a narrower number of crops to feed the universe. And our food systems are globalized. So basically, we're more and more eating more similar food. I mean, those fast food chains are a big example of what is eaten in, as I said, whether you are in Lagos or in Casablanca or even in Suva in Fiji, you tend to eat more or less the same thing. We tend to eat more and more things that are traded globally, that are coming from elsewhere, that are not produced locally. We also have an issue with the food waste. I mean, that's a major problem. But our globalized food system is extremely heavily dependent on carbon, and that's why I made the parallel in the very beginning about what I call fossil food, because basically these foods are consuming lots of fossil energy. And we need to get out of that dependence on fossil energy. And that's something that most of the countries, if you want to meet the recommendations of the Paris Agreement, when it comes to climate change, we need to reduce our dependency on and the footprint of carbon of these crops. But okay, now that we know that we are depending on so few crops, one could ask the question, why? I mean, why do we only consume wheat, rice, and maize? Well, the first question is for historical reasons. I mean, these are there's a painting coming from the Egyptians, and some others coming from that represents wheat. I mean, quite tall wheat at that time. And rice is being cultivated in China for ages. Same goes for maize in Mexico and other places in Latin America. So basically, rice, maize, and wheat have a long history with humanity. They're also they have been developed by the evolution of the concept of the state itself, because when you have grains, you could easily tax people in an easy way, whether than you have crops that you could not conserve for a long time, you would not be able to control what is being produced and therefore tax people properly. The second reason is the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, of course, is represented by the figure of Norman Borlaug, who had introduced a quite number of revolutionary ways of looking at our crops, from tall crops to dwarf ones, but and higher yielding varieties. I mean, Yuan Longping did the same thing that Norman Borlaug did on wheat, and Yuan Longping developed some of these rice varieties that also revolutionized the way we look at crops today, and made those crops popular and able to be grown somewhere else. I mean, where the center of origin initially is. But the result of this is that, of course, we have higher yielding varieties of wheat and rice, which is good to feed the population, but we also have an increased use of fertilizer and pesticides, and we should not forget that. And that's why those crops were exposed and they were exported and grown almost everywhere in the world. The other reason for that global decline in crop diversity is that international agricultural research and development agencies, if you take the CGIAR, where I worked for a certain number of years, most of the research of the CG is devoted to those main crops. Of course, you also have some minor crops that are included somewhere else here, for instance, in the root tubers and bananas. So historically, there was much more investment from a research point of view on these crops, on wheat, rice, and many other, and of course, maize. But if we look how things evolved, that's a graph that is coming from the Global Nutrition Report of 2020. There is a newer version of 2022, but the conclusion is more or less the same. And you can see basically that the total consumption of calories has increased, which means we're eating more. But if you look at the contribution of the cereals, basically maize, rice, etc., between the 70s and 2010, you'd see that the share was more than 51% of the global calorie intake. Now it's 46%, which means that there's a loss of 5%. 5% is not negligible, which means that the share is globally declining, but the funding is still not following, because the agricultural policy is still heavily biased towards improving those staple grain productivity, specifically and especially for the major staples, while the fact is that our dietary diversity is changing. I mean, is changing a bit, and the share of these things are different. Okay, the other problem of the global decline of crop diversity is that you have a regional specialization in the production of food. So if we look at this map that shows where food is basically produced, and that's a report from 2017, you could see that many regions, I mean, I'll speak about that a bit in a moment. You see that Russia is contributing a lot. China, of course, India and the United States are contributing a lot and concentrating the production of certain foods, which means that not only we have a dependency on very few crops, but even these few crops, the main concentration of production is very much reduced. It's within the hands of very little countries and geographic areas. And if you look at the results of what this could have, I don't know why this is not shifting. Okay, there is an issue of food security. I mean, that shows you in 2019 the share of the international trade versus the local trade of staple crops. You could see that for many countries, it's a matter of national security to have enough reserves of these crops. But the recent war in Ukraine shows us that we are becoming increasingly dependent. If you look at this graph that has been released by UNCTAD about some of the African countries, you would see that the dependency on just wheat that is produced in Russia and Ukraine is quite important. I mean, it could be reaching percentages that are up to 100%, which is quite worrying. In countries basically like Somalia, Benin in West Africa, means that they are importing 100% of the wheat that is produced, that is consumed locally. I'm having problems with, it's not shifting smoothly. Can you still see the same slide?
Yes, in fact.
Okay, there is an issue there. I don't know where the problem is. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, I'm sorry for this. So the SAO has released recently the share of the wheat import dependency on Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that's the one direct result of the war in Russia and Ukraine. And you can see that some countries are 100% dependent on these two countries. It's not a matter of production, it's a matter of transport. Even if the war stops today, we still have issues by transporting wheat, because it has to go through a certain number of borders from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus, and in many other places. It's not only a matter of surfaces and areas produced, it's a matter of dependency on a global trade, on the one staple crop that is traded globally, and that is still concentrated in very few regions. The day you have a problem in those very few regions, you will have an impact, and this is starting to show off in so many in the prices. I mean, if you go to the supermarket, the prices have increased. Even if the governments want to control that, there will still be increases in those products, because again, we depend on a globally traded system, and we rely on very few crops to do that. The challenges that we also face by doing this, if you look at the productivity, for instance, here in India, about traditional crops such as millet or sorghum, has been stagnant everywhere. I mean, the India was not increasing its production in those traditional crops compared to crops like wheat, for instance, that doesn't originate from the region, but it's still consumed heavily. It means that people basically are eating more wheat and maize and rice rather than millet and sorghum, which are traditional crops. And those have impacts because in areas with higher diversity of food commodities, like the graph is shown here. So you have a higher H, you have the regions with a green and light green. The areas with higher diversity of food commodities would produce much more nutrients, micronutrients, than do areas with less diversity. If you can see here, the concentration of zinc in those areas with very low diversity are still very low, even if the total calorie uptake is still the same. And if you add on top of that, that you have climate change that is impacting and that will have an impact on these crops, look at these scenarios. We will have in different scenarios between minus 28% of yield loss, and in the best case scenario, if we manage to reduce the temperature and if we do all the mitigation possible, we will still have a 9% loss. That means that the population is increasing. We're dependent on very low number of crops, and these crops would be heavily impacted. Look at the numbers: 28% for maize, minus 22 in the worst case scenario for wheat. Soybean and rice are more or less the same, 12 to 11%, which means that they will be heavily impacted, regardless of what is going on recently today between Russia and Ukraine, and the war that, in addition to the casualties that it is causing a worldwide food problem. So we have concentrated the different types of crisis. We have climate change, we have a biodiversity loss, we have an environmental degradation, we have lots of malnutrition in the world, which is called the hidden hunger, the nutrient deficiencies, and non-communicable diseases. Obesity is increasing because of diet change. And we have these four crises are completely interlinked and with our food systems. And they're accounting for lots of problems and issues of specifically for human greenhouse gas emission and major drive of loss of habitat and biodiversity. So I hope I have convinced you that there is a problem there. That today we are looking into 4 crops to ensure more than half of our calories. So we are just tapping into 1% of the diversity that is still available to us. It is exactly the same if you are an investor. It's exactly the same case where you would have a stock portfolio with very, very few holdings. I mean, everyone would tell you that relying just on very few holdings is quite risky. You need to diversify. We also agree that we need to diversify away from our fossil energy sources. So why not diversifying also from our, again, what I call fossil food, because they are also heavily relying on those. They need fertilizers, they need water, and they need lots of things, and they will be heavily impacted by climate change. They are causing us lots of problems because of our global diet that is becoming increasingly homogeneous. So can we nourish 10 billion people in a hotter planet with just 4 crops? I guess for me, the answer is very clear. The answer is no. And we are going into our food system is exactly like the Titanic. We're the captain of the Titanic chose explicitly to ignore the iceberg. and to say, well, just an iceberg, how can a ship as big as the Titanic be drawn by an iceberg? And the result is that the Titanic ended up at the bottom of the ocean. And unfortunately, the people who had less money, who were in the lower docks, ended up dying, where those who had more money managed to save themselves. And it's exactly the same type of thing that we will be facing. We are in a Titanic food system that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. And I think that forgotten foods are the answer to do that. And that's why I want to spend some time looking at what do we mean by forgotten crops. We need to look at those crops that have been traditionally grown by many people around the world, that they haven't been researched well enough, and they could be really an opportunity to first to diversify, and second to move away from those all the problems, because they are well adapted to the local conditions. They have been eaten by the people for years and years. Why are we moving away from that? And when we say that they are forgotten, we need to know that the answer is quite simple. We need to exactly know they are forgotten by whom, and certainly not by farmers. Farmers do still keep those crops. They still keep them alive. They keep on cultivating and eating those crops. They're forgotten just by us, by the researchers, by the international research organization, and even by the funding agency that spend much more resources on very, very, very few crops. So what do we mean by forgotten crops? You have different terminology that has been extensively used. People say orphan, forgotten, minor, neglected, underutilized. All sorts of things are acceptable, but basically those are crops that are not traded internationally, but that could eventually play a key role in regional food security, that has received little attention from breeders and research organizations that wish to improve their productivity. And the subject has been attracting more and more attention in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. There was a manifesto that was launched last year in shortly, maybe in June 2021, by a number of organizations that I'm citing here, and that call for a plan of action for these crops to enhance their use. There is even an Africa community of practice on forgotten foods. So that's an important initiative, because there is a plan to the future, and how is it going to happen. We also launched recently the Forgotten Crop Society. That is an initiative out of Mohammed VI Polytechnic University and the University of Cambridge, that is also attracting a number of people around the world, and I'm putting here the link to the society. The goals are to raise awareness of these crops so they are no longer abandoned, to encourage their conservation, of course, and the maintenance of what we call the traditional knowledge around them, because we need to look to farmers in a different way, because they are no longer receiving the technology. We shouldn't look at them as mere receivers of technology, but also actors of transformation, because they hold the knowledge about these traditional crops. And the ultimate objective is to reintroduce those into our cropping systems slowly and gradually, by keeping also the investment on mainstream crops. Again, I'm not advocating to stop investing on wheat, maize, and other things. I'm saying, let's be careful and watch out. We need to diversify. It's no longer something that is good to have. it is something that we must have. Otherwise, the Titanic is just the example and the problem that we will be facing if we don't do that properly. So I'm calling for the diversification of these, moving a bit away from mainstream agricultural crops. Recently, because of the crisis in Ukraine, I have heard calls to increase the wheat surfaces in Africa. I personally think that this is not a very good idea. It depends where in Africa, but in sub-Saharan Africa, people used to grow things that are very different. They don't grow wheat. They didn't grow wheat in the past. Why should they grow wheat today? They were eating sorghum. They were eating millet for ages. I think we need to invest more on these rather than just do more of the same and go back to business as usual. So with that, I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to have your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghanem, for this rich talk, which highlighted our heavy reliance on a limited number of food sources, and also the initiative taken and also the potential initiative to mitigate the risk that are associated to this situation. I will look we are waiting for the question. There is 2 questions until now. The first one from Kahir Suhail from UM6P. He's asking, do you suggest that we identify some crops globally which can be promoted by researchers and funders, which can be comparatively easy? Or do you suggest to go for local crops, which would require a lot of effort, especially in developed countries? In developing countries, maybe. The other problem, easiness of storage, also play an important part in crop selection.
Yes, thank you, Tahir, for the question. I guess the balance is extremely difficult to strike. We should not fall into the same type of errors by looking at global crops. Because we will be reproducing exactly the same type of mistakes that we have done with crops that are grown globally, maize, wheat, rice, etc. I think, and I agree with your comment that this could be easily reached if we want to look for those some of the crops that could grow globally everywhere. I think we should change that. There should be a paradigm shift in the way we look at that, and instead of investing on just a few of them, we should be investing on regionally adapted crops, which are definitely not going to be the same depending on the region. So for instance, there is no point of investing on crops that are heavily dependent on water, or they're not well adapted to some areas when you have other alternatives. For instance, millets, sorghum, I mean, that should be the priority. Teff, fonio, and it's also millet, should be the priority for those crops. There is no such thing as a magic bullet. I'm advocating for something that is locally adapted and that is not exactly the same across the world, because the way that we should look at that is reduce the dependency on food that is coming from thousands of miles away, that is transported and that is costing lots of energy sources.
Okay, thank you. The second question from Omar Idrisi from INRA Morocco. He's asking to which extent diversifying farming and food systems through investing more in research and also subsidies in neglected crops would help to reduce the world dependency on few crops, especially for developing countries.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with what Dr. Idrisi is saying. I mean, I guess it's grain legumes have been abandoned and neglected for a long time ago. and they need to be brought back into the scenery in a way or another. I mean, just take the example of Morocco. Morocco used to produce faba bean and even export that in the 60s and the 70s. It's no longer the case today. I guess those legumes, the grain legumes, are and will be, along with traditional cereals. I mean, barley is definitely an example. I mean, they should be the priority of our investments, specifically because they are nutrient rich. They don't need that much fertilization, for instance, in the case of grain legumes. So I cannot agree more. I have a personal weakness for grain legumes, and I think we should be looking more into those all over Africa.
The next question from Dr. Khalid El-Rohili. He is asking, how can we identify forgotten crops locally?
Yes, I mean, that's the terminology is quite tricky, because what is forgotten according to which criteria? And I guess the first criteria would be looking at what people traditionally consumed, maybe in the past, or even still consume today, and looking at if these crops have received some attention from the research, and just look at, for instance, at the number of publications on these crops compared to those published on wheat, maize, and rice. And I guess there should be a work that combines both an agronomic perspective and socioeconomic, because we need to look at what people traditionally were eating. And again, we might identify, I mean, there's a big work that has been started for a crop in Western Africa and even in Ethiopia, which is called African yam bean, which is a fantastic plant, but nobody has paid attention to that crop for a long time ago. So I guess looking at what people were eating before, what is adapted to the local ecology, and what are they eating now, just to meet that requirement also. And I think also is giving more value to these crops is key, because if we tend or continue presenting them as, I mean, that's a common expression that is being adopted all over, the poor man's crop or whatever it is. It means that if you're poor, you'll eat meat. For a long time ago, we used to say grain legumes are poor man's meat. No, they're not poor man's meat. I mean, it means that if you are poor, you should eat lentil and chickpea, but otherwise you'll go and eat meat. I mean, we should reverse the tide and look at them from a positive perspective.
Perfect. For your question about the recording of the presentation, it will be shared by tomorrow on the INRA website and also on LinkedIn page of INRA. Thank you. This next question from Dr. Muhafir Rahi from INRA. He raised the question of seed availability to promote the neglected crops. And he is asking to elaborate more on which neglected crops that could be promoted to enhance food security.
Yes, I fully agree with that. I think the seed availability is one of the major issues in addressing these crops. But and that's why I think there is need to first to make an effort about surveying which crops to target first, which ones to look at first, making priority investment. Otherwise, it won't be useful. You know, we can't start working on all the crops that has been abandoned. Typically, if I go back into the case of Morocco, I think one of the I would say the grain legumes should be brought back again into the picture. Diversified a bit, and some cereals, typically barley, should be again brought back into the global picture and given more attention in that. But of course, yeah, we need to start somewhere. So if a number of researchers start by looking at these crops, I think we'll solve the problem of seed availability gradually.
Before asking the next question, I would like to mention that you can also, to the participant, that you can also ask your question orally. Please raise your electronic hands if you want to talk also, to ask your question orally. So the next question from Qiyamotik from INRA. He's asking about quinoa as an alternative crop to reduce the dependency on major crops, mainly wheat, rice, and corn.
Yes, I mean, quinoa is just an example of a neglected crop. I mean, it used to be neglected for ages. If you look at the 70s or even the 80s, who used to consume quinoa around the world? Maybe in Latin America, but not more than that. Very few people beyond that limit used to consume quinoa. Now, quinoa is consumed mostly everywhere. I mean, and there are great initiatives in Morocco that have introduced that, and it has a good potential. But I just want to raise a red flag here and ring a bell and to say that we should not fall into the other extreme. It means that we should not overemphasize again on one crop as being the solution, but rather look at diversifying. So yeah, quinoa could be one answer, but it shouldn't be the only answer.
Dr. Iman Tami Alami from INRA, he's asking about maintaining biodiversity, which can be a trade-off of yes, to deal with. We must share biodiversity and knowledge related to this.
I mean, for sure, if they are forgotten, they are forgotten, and they should not be forgotten from a genetic resources perspective. If they disappear, then they're gone. They're definitely gone, and that is exactly the threat that is facing the threat that is we end up not using them, and we end up not conserving them. And once a species is gone, it's gone. We can't resurrect it again. So definitely keeping those crops and the resources is capital. And key also is the sharing the resources. I mean, that's a big problem when it comes to sharing genetic resources between countries. I mean, there are barriers, obviously, but they also need to be addressed. So we don't introduce additional diseases when moving the material. So that's why I think that there is a need to a global effort, like the global effort that has been done on few crops. People now share wheat seeds all over the world. They share it in a way that is I mean, commonly agreed upon, that doesn't disseminate diseases all over. So yeah, biodiversity is key. Keeping it is key, and sharing it is another key. So we would avoid repeating the mistakes that happened somewhere else.
Oh. Dr. Moha Farahi, he raised the question of some constraints that are affecting the decrease of some species. He mentioned that decrease of faba bean area in Morocco is linked to several constraints, biotic and abiotic, drought, orange, stresses, subsidies in seed production and others, and also constraints linked to the labor needed for food legume production is a very serious problem. It's a comment, in fact. But yes, please.
No, I cannot agree more. I'm not saying that it's a simple problem, and there's a cause that we have abandoned, that faba bean was abandoned in Morocco. It must have been abandoned for a reason. And Dr. Farah is listing a quite extensive list of problems, and I do agree with all of them. But if drought is a problem on faba bean, then let's address drought on faba bean. If orobanki is a problem on faba bean, let's address orobanki on faba bean, and not shift. We'll say enough of faba bean. Let's put wheat instead.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. My question, because there is no further question, the question from Najari Sara.
I think there is Professor Bakawi who raised his hand. I can see it.
Okay, okay. Oh, yes, the floor is yours, Professor Bakawi.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
Thank you, Michel, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sorry I may have missed some bits because of another meeting, but my question is, how do you reconcile between food security and the subject of your talk of forgotten foods? From some statistics I'm sure you're familiar with, that from the FAO, that we need to improve productivity by 60% in 2050. And knowing that these four major crops that you listed, wheat, rice, corn in particular, have been researched for the last 100 years, and their productivity has been improved significantly compared to some millets and wheat, where not a lot of research has been done. And I mean, personally, I think it's a good idea to maintain a minimum of biodiversity, but sometimes when you have to choose between food security and let's say in some of the sub-Saharan African, where you need to feed some people, sometimes maybe the choice going to wheat or corn maybe a better one, again, just to feed enough people. So I know it may be not an easy answer, but that's something we have to deal with. Then suppose now we are going to choose some of these forgotten food. Which one on the global and maybe local level should we choose to do more research so that we can arrive to better productivity, at least to improve what's the level now? Thank you.
Thank you, Fawzi. I do agree with you. I mean, if they are mainstream crops, they are mainstream crops for a reason. I mean, obviously they provide a big chunk of our food requirements, not only calories but other things. I'm not saying that we should abandon these, and definitely not. But where I tend to disagree with you to some extent is the choice. We have been making that choice for food security immediately by investing on these mainstream crops for ages. And this has, and it is causing a number of issues. I mean, look at the results of the war in Ukraine. If we continue pushing people to consume more and more wheat, if you take in sub-Saharan Africa, because this is what has been done, to be honest. I mean, I lived in the Pacific, and I still remember people in front of my house picnicking with big loaves of white bread and butter, while you can't grow a single spike of wheat in the Pacific. You can't grow that. It's virtually impossible. Or if you want to do it, it will cost you a fortune. But instead, they had other things. They had tubers, they had lots of vegetables, of course, as alternative. I'm not saying that we should shift back and we should drop all of these things, but maybe we should, along with the investment that we need to keep doing to increase the productivity of the mainstream crops, because that's a requirement. Otherwise, I mean, people cannot wait until we do research on these crops and we improve their productivity and their costing. But I'm saying that in parallel, while investing on the mainstream crops, we should also invest on the other crops, so that at a certain time we would inject more and more diversity into our food system, while giving the priority, of course, to immediate fixes. But this should not be the way forward. I mean, we should not be always choosing the quick fixes of investing more in wheat. I've heard people advocating and even calling for increasing wheat areas in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa has been growing sorghum and millet for ages. Why do you want to shift to wheat in places like Senegal Benin and Nigeria. I mean, you can do that in other places in Africa where wheat is more suitable.
Can you help me with the earphone?
I think there is.
Please, sorry, Fabiola, please mute your mic. Fabiola, please mute your mic, please.
Okay. Yeah, so that's why I'm saying I'm not calling to abandon research on the mainstream crops. I'm saying let's also.
I understand.
It's no longer a luxury; it's a must. It's not something that it's good to have. No, it's a must-have. And I think the problem of we didn't learn from the pandemics where we stopped trading. Shall we learn from the war in Ukraine? I'm not sure, but let's do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mkawi, for your question, and Professor Ghanem for your answer. Omar Idrisi, he's asking what would help to encourage farmers to produce for local markets rather than international markets? Market interests or subsidies?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both. There should be, we should strike the right balance between, it shouldn't be all subsidies, because otherwise we will not be helping people go independent on these. I guess we can create the market. I mean, there should be, if you recall what happened to quinoa, which went all the way from being maybe a neglected crop to a no longer neglected crop, the market was created. I mean, and the products locally was also enhanced and encouraged. And I guess that is how things happened. So it's encouraging people to consume food that is produced locally by giving more value to local production. I mean, if you look at the trend in Europe and basically specifically in Europe, there is an accent that and even subsidies for consuming food that has been produced within a 30 kilometers area. So basically, I think you need a mixture of market creation, developing added value, looking at the entire value chain, and a mix, and of course subsidies where subsidies are needed.
Okay. The question from Moise Amri, at what extent these forgotten crops could help in meeting nutritional security?
Yes, very good question, Moise. I think that these crops have an extreme richness. Some of them are extremely rich in some micronutrients that are extremely important. So besides the fact of looking at the calorie intake of a certain person, we should also look at the quality of the food that we're giving to the people. And these crops are often richer and should be first analyzed, investigated, because to be honest, we don't know much about these crops, and there's the room to, we don't know much about the value of the nutritional value of these crops, and if we come to know maybe that they are maybe a richer, naturally rich, or they have a natural way of having a higher say iron concentration, why not including them instead of investing on something that is not going to add iron into the crop itself? So yeah, I think that's a very good point that Moise is making. The nutritional value of these crops are often not looked at, and this is why where we could eventually put them back into the system throughout that particular point, because they probably have a higher nutritional value and they're richer than the mainstream one.
Perfect. I have a question, Professor Ghanem, about your initiative, the Forgotten Crops Society. Are you able to mobilize funds to work with? And also, did you make some progress towards the milestones you fixed, you set?
Yes. So the aim of the society was basically to raise awareness. It's a scientific society. It's not an initiative that aims at mobilizing funding, but we're also working with many other initiatives in the world for that. For instance, we are in very close contact with the institutions that have launched the Forgotten Food, the Manifesto on Forgotten Food. And throughout that channel, there are opportunities. Just recently, I've heard that the Rockefeller Foundation has released an opportunity for funding for these crops. FFAR has a call recently throughout some of the actions that the Forgotten Food Manifesto has released. There is a call specifically for looking on how to identify which crops have a perspective value, coming back to what Maiz mentioned about from a nutritional perspective. The society that we have founded is an open scientific society, so everyone is welcome to join. The link is easily found, and I put it in the presentation. It aims at assembling those who are working on these crops from different parts of the world, and we also tend to, where there are opportunities, we leverage partnership. We have been in discussion with Harvest Plus, for instance, to look at funding opportunities in specific areas in West Africa. So that's it's the Forgotten Crop Society has been launched in July 2021, so it's less than a year now. We organize lots of, we have a dialogue, a series of webinars and dialogues. We've hosted a number of people that are interested in that. We're doing the same thing. At the end of this month, we also have a webinar on this dialogue. We had Pierre Thiam inaugurating our talks. Pierre is a chef, a worldwide chef that has spent lots of time investing on fonio as a crop in the Senegal. And we also had the scientists from the African Orphan Crops Consortium. We're also publishing a white paper about as a response to the crisis in Ukraine. There is, not revealing a secret, there is a comment that is going to be published shortly in Nature that gathers many people around the world, including His Excellency, the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries in Morocco, precisely to advocate for that. And there is a series of action that is planned. So I'll be more than happy to provide the linkage between the Forgotten Crop Society and any other possibilities.
Perfect. Thanks. So this is one of the main purpose of this webinar series, is to network between people and between initiatives. So it's okay.
Sure.
I think people who are interested can get in touch with you. Yeah.
Sure. Yes, and the link is easily found. You can look at the link. If you Google the Forgotten Crop Society, you easily find us. And you just drop us an email, and I'll be adding those who are on the list. Maybe you, Dr. Vecheloun, will add you to the mailing list, so you will receive also our calls for the dialogues that we're organizing.
Okay, and also people that are interested can get
Sure.
directly in touch with you. That's perfect.
Definitely, yes.
Thank you. There is a last question from Mohammed Boulouz, M6P. Industrialization that need only some crops rather than the others, cereal especially. What do you think will be the reflection from these companies, and also what is the effect of their influence on the decision making of the authorities?
Yes, I mean, you could argue that maybe big companies know how to transform wheat, how to include that, or maize or rice or whatever. But this is changing for other crops. Just take an example from West Africa. There were some initiatives looking at maybe adding more sorghum into the flour making, the dough making, and the bread making in West Africa, looking at different millets. You could take an example of Morocco, even for couscous. You had, you were having a huge variety of, couscous based on quinoa, diversifying that. Of course, there is a need at all levels. I'm not excluding one single level of research. All the research is needed at all levels, starting with agronomy to crop physiology to looking at their nutritional value, how to transform them, and instead how to add value to this, how to make people eat them again. So we would not be going back again to the same good old crops that basically have brought us to this situation. And I see a comment of the sinking ship, and I think we're very close to that. We still can avoid the iceberg. Let's do it before it's too late.
So, thank you very much, Professor Ghanem. We are reaching now the end of this webinar. I would like to mention to everyone that by leaving the webinar, you will get a very short survey to get your assessment of this webinar series, Please fill it, it will be helpful. At the end of this survey, of this questionnaire, there is the opportunity to request your attendance certificate for those who want it. Finally, I would like to mention that the next webinar, maybe my colleagues will share the flyer of the next webinar. It will be held on the 12th of May in a month. It will be in French. It will be entitled La gestion de l'eau dans les territoires agricoles. It will be given by Dr. Jérôme Molina. Maybe, yes, my colleague have shared the flyer by Jérôme Molina, senior scientist at INRA, France. Okay. You are welcome. You'll be welcome to attend. So finally, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank everyone who participated today and to thank warmly our guest speaker, Dr. Michel Edmond Ghanem, for his rich talk. And also I would like to thank Dr. Abdelaziz Yasri for his great contribution to prepare this webinar. I would like also to thank warmly my colleague Othman Sabata, Boutaina Abidour, Dad Tirazi, and Nordin Bahri, and all the scientific committee of the INRA webinar series for their crucial contribution in the organizing of this series. So would you like to add something, Professor Ghanem?
No, I really want to extend my thanks to INRA, and I know, and to yourself for bearing with me for all the technical exchanges that we've had, and also thank Aziz for his kind invitation. I think in Morocco today, there is an opportunity to look at more diversification, specifically with the crisis and the drought that we have experienced, which is extremely severe. So let's work on that. There are great initiatives. What is going on quinoa is definitely one of them. Let's go and look for more and more of these opportunities, and bring back all of these forgotten, neglected crops to the picture again. Thank you so much, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We have a whole group at UM6P working on this across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So see you in a month on the 12th of May. Bye-bye to everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.